Okay, friends, lecture number 25. We're almost done with this course. All right, during our previous lecture, we addressed such topics as Civil War campaigns, Civil War battles, and we spent quite a bit of time on that, almost the entire class period. And like I said the other day, if we wanted to teach an entire course in Civil War history, we can do so. That's generally reserved for that of a graduate school and a person in a graduate program. But when we were last together, we talked about various campaigns such as Manassas, and the battle at Manassas, some people refer to it as Bull Run. There were actually two battles there. You had first Manassas, that's the one that we talked about. Later had second Manassas too. So two battles on the same battlefield in different years. And we'll talk about the battle that took place at Shiloh, 6th and 7th of April, 1862. Beautiful battlefield. I recommend that you go up there on the weekend, and you'll enjoy that area. Go to Corinth, Mississippi, the home of the famous slug burger, whatever in the world that is anyway. All right, and we also talked about Antietam, the single bloodiest one-day battle of the American Civil War, 23,110 casualties, that is on both sides combined. And we talked about Chancellorsville that took place in May of 1863. Not much to that battlefield. It's all residential areas now. But you can go to the actual site where Stonewall Jackson was, shall we say, grievously injured and subsequently had his arm amputated and died shortly after that. All right, we also talked about Gettysburg. Gettysburg, a wonderful battlefield to visit. You know, you enjoy that area of the world. In the southern parts of Pennsylvania, I certainly do. As I told you the other day, I spent 2 years of my life up there. And we closed out the Civil War talking about Appomattox. And that's where the surrender took place there. You can go to the Appomattox battlefield, not much in the way of a battlefield, but you can see Appomattox Courthouse if you wish to do so, McLean House, and it's all kind of interesting. And in the closing parts of the class period, we talked about Reconstruction, this brutal period of time in Southern history where we're going to see a defeated South being subjected to their literally cruelty by a vindictive North. For the North, Northern Republicans were determined that the Old South was not going to return. And by golly, the Old South is not going to return. It will be a new South that will rise from the ashes there. Alrighty, so I'm going to flip to my camera here, and we'll kind of get ourselves going here into the lecture because we have a lot to talk about today here. Reconstruction is a period of time I'm talking about. Much of the South had been destroyed. Here is you can see in your textbook here, here's a photograph. It's very similar to one in your textbook. One in your textbook has Richmond, and this is likewise Richmond here. This is what it looked like at the end of the Civil War, and I have to tell you in all fairness that much of this destruction was caused by the Confederates as they knew the end was in sight and they were abandoning the city, and so they just torched the city. And we will likewise see shortly after this, and I'm talking about in the next 40 to 50 years, and for many in the South, you probably recognize something like this. This is a Confederate monument. Actually, this is of Sam Davis. Sam Davis, he was murdered by Northern troops up in Pulaski, Tennessee. But anyway, this is just Pulaski, Tennessee is a southern town, and it's just one of many, many southern towns, of course, that have memories of the old days, if you will. Go downtown Jasper, Alabama, and you see the same thing there. And if I remember right, the statue of Confederate soldiers in downtown Jasper, I think that was constructed in 1909. I believe it was anyway. I may be off a year or so with that. Okay, but much of the South has been destroyed here. Let's go back to our notes here. We had 618,000 that died in the Civil War from the North and the South. Approximately 264,000 Confederate dead, 311,000 Northern dead. I think I told you the other day we had 38,000 blacks that lost, soldiers, sailors that lost their lives by various means, you know, in the war. And you can only imagine, if these are the dead numbers here, how many others were wounded, incapacitated. You know, it's just going to eliminate a generation of American youth, both in the North and from the South. You know, so it was a broken situation. All right, we also had an organization that was formed, which was called the Freedmen's Bureau. And I want you to recognize this. It's called the Freedmen's Bureau. General Oliver O. Howard only had one arm, Oliver O. Howard. People called him Uh-oh or O-O. And the Freedmen's Bureau was designed to provide for former slaves, provide them with food, education, mission assistance, missionary work, and and that sort of thing. All right, I don't know how effective the Freedmen's Bureau was. You can see a photograph of the Freedmen's Bureau School in your textbook, and later in the class period, I'll show you Freedmen's Bureau School photograph attached with some others, so I'm going to wait for a more appropriate time here. Okay, so let's move on here. Now, the Republicans were extremely powerful at this period of time. The political party that was in dominance in the North was the Republican Party. The South was Democrat. That's just the way it always was here. We're going to see that to reverse the roles later in history, but it will not be this semester anyway. But the Republicans were extremely powerful. In fact, they were too powerful at that time. You know, in our government, we have the executive branch, legislative branch, judiciary branch. But at this time, the legislative branch was more powerful than the president himself, or shortly will be anyway. Now, the Republicans were organized into conservative Republicans, and for the conservative Republicans, the only thing they really wanted was just to abolish slavery. And then we had another group, which were the moderate Republicans. Under the moderate Republicans, they wanted to abolish slavery, but let's get some concessions from the South. Let's punish the South a little bit. And then where the bad part of it came were the radical Republicans. The radical Republicans, and these were the ones that not only wanted to abolish slavery and punish the South, but let's inflict some really, really heavy damage on the South. And two members here that were a part of this, the radical Republicans, that's what they referred to as. You had Thaddeus Stevens, who was a congressman from the House of Representatives from Pennsylvania, and our old friend Charles Sumner, who is a senator from Massachusetts. Everybody remember the caning of Sumner? Everybody remember that by Preston Brooks, the caning of Sumner. And Charles Sumner lost his Senate seat for 3 years. He was too incapacitated to return to his seat. But now he is back. And you know how he feels about Southerners. And he's going to be one of the driving forces going to punish the South. Now, how do you hurt the Southerners? How do you hurt somebody that supported the war or fought in the war? Bearing in mind here, folks, that for the vast Southern majority males, you didn't have any choice on this. You were drafted into service. But what you can do here, you disenfranchise. That means you remove the right to vote. So if you fought for the Confederacy, if you supported the Confederacy, and you're a man, you lost your right to vote. And also, if you fought for the Confederacy or supported the Confederacy, you had your property confiscated. And what's going to happen to that property here, folks? And you probably have figured it out by now. When your property is confiscated, the plan was to distribute it to former slaves. All right, so anyway, it's going to cause a tough period of time in our country. All right, so let's move on with this. And whatever happened to Jefferson Davis? And Jefferson Davis was actually captured in Georgia, and it was the same group that came through Jasper, Alabama, the northern troops that came through Jasper, Alabama, that actually captured Jefferson Davis. The North spread the rumor that Jefferson Davis was dressed in female clothing, that he was trying to disguise himself, and that's just fake news there, folks. All righty, but Jefferson Davis was sent to Fort Monroe. He was never charged, but he was sent to Fort Monroe, Virginia. This is what Fort Monroe looks like. It's an old military installation. I don't know if it's open to the public now, but inside of there you can actually find where the quarters were for Jefferson Davis, and this is where he was kept. This is a little bunk that he was kept in. Had a writing desk there. Some people have the rumors that lights were always kept on for 2 years, that he was a prisoner there. I don't know if that was true or not, but never charged with any kind of crime, and then after 2 years he was released, and he returned to his home, which is down in Biloxi, Mississippi, between Biloxi and Hattiesburg, Mississippi, a place called Beauvoir. It's kind of an interesting place to visit if you ever want to do that. For Alexander Hamilton Stevens, the vice president of the country, Alexander Hamilton Stevens, was sent to Fort Warren. That's in Boston Harbor, and that's where he was kept there for 5 months, and he was released. Okay, so let's move on here now. Now, I want to go through a couple of Reconstruction plans as we move through this. And the first one we wish to mention is that of Lincoln's Reconstruction plan. Some people refer to this as the 10% plan. The 10% plan, the proper name for it was the Proclamation of Amnesty and Reconstruction. And basically what it was is when 10% of the voters of the census of 1860 had sworn an oath of allegiance to the United States of America and stopped their fighting then the state could reform a government. Well, for the radical Republicans weren't about to go along with that, and so the Lincoln's Reconstruction plan just never did materialize. And I'm going to tell you, good folks, right now, Abraham Lincoln was the one person this country needed most, for the North and for the South. All right, so shall we move on here? And another bill, and this is going to come out of Congress anyway, which is called the Wade-Davis bill, changed the 10% plan a little bit, and not just 10% of the population of the 1860 census, but now under the Wade-Davis bill, when the majority of the population of a state swore an ironclad oath of allegiance, whatever that means, to the United States of America, then they could reform a government. And under this new government, no former members of the Confederate government or anybody that has supported the Confederacy could be a part of this. Well, Mr. Lincoln pocket vetoed the Wade-Davis bill. And I'll tell you for the second time what our country needs most here, folks. We need Abraham Lincoln. But I want to carry you to a date here, and this is a memorable date in history, which is the April the 14th in 1865. And let me just tell you about the President of the United States at this point here, folks. Mr. Lincoln, and I showed you the photographs of him before, has aged dramatically. The war had weighed heavily on his shoulders here. He's aged, he can't sleep at night, he has nightmares, reoccurring dreams about his own death, his own assassination. And what the president needs most, he needs some entertainment. Just get out of the White House for an evening, go someplace and relax, and just like we used to do here, folks, we would go to a movie, we would go to a theater. Well, at that time, they didn't have movies like we have today, but what they did have, they had theaters that had dramatic productions. And I'm going to go back to my camera so we can see the names of these theaters. And anyway, where am I right here? This is Abraham Lincoln. And one of the plays that was being performed in Washington, D.C. that night, to be performed at Grover's Theater, was a play which was known as Aladdin the Wonderful Lamp. And so actually tickets were sent out, and the tickets were purchased. Or I should say, a messenger was sent out and tickets were purchased for the Lincolns to go to that play. Well, it turned out that there was another play that was going to be shown that night, acted that night, over at Ford's Theater. And this play was known as Our American Cousin. It was a British play. It was actually a satire, a parody upon Americans and how dumb we are. But anyway, it was a funny play. And it just so happens that one of the most popular actresses in our country at that time, Laura Keene, was performing at Ford's Theater in Our American Cousin. So the plans were changed for the Lincolns to not go to see Aladdin the Wonderful Lamp, but to go to Ford's Theater. All right. Okay, so anyway, Miss Lincoln, Mary Todd Lincoln, she extended an invitation to General Grant and his wife, Julia Grant. And at first, General Grant said, yeah, we will accompany the president and his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln. And then and apparently there's some bad blood between Mary Todd Lincoln and Julia Dent and Grant's wife. And Miss Grant just at the last minute just said, no, I'm not going to spend the evening with that hussy or whatever it is anyway. So instead, Miss Lincoln invited Clara Harris. Now, Clara Harris, who was the daughter of one of the senators at that time in Washington, D.C., and she insisted she wanted to bring along her fiancé, who was also her stepbrother. I know it gets a little bit hinky right here, folks, and this was a military man in the military. He was Major Henry Rathbone. All right, and they accepted. All right, so let me see if I can find some photographs here showing you. Some of you probably have seen Ford's Theater. This is what it looks like here, folks. And so when you go into Ford's Theater, and by the way, it is free, but you have to get a ticket. You have to get a ticket there and then wait for the appropriate time. But what the normal way to go in, you would enter through the center door, which is right here. Let me find my pencil so you don't look at my stubby fingers. And enter into the center door here. And you would go down the corridor, which is this way here, on the inside now. And what the Lincolns would do, they would go up the stairs, ascend the stairs here, up to the top here, and then go down to where the president's booth was. It's like a skybox. It's right here, the skybox. The owner of the theater, John Ford, decorated the president's booth here. He put a couple of flags here and flags on both sides, searched around trying to find a portrait here of Abraham Lincoln and could not. So they found one of George Washington Washington, and they put the one for George Washington present there. Okay, so I'm going to go back here and let me see if I can find something else here. And I hate to leave you like that for just a second, but I want to show you a National Park Service brochure of Ford's Theater. All right, and we'll try to get this to where it's not too much of a glare on it. But that's Ford's Theater from the outside. And if you look, you can see a cutaway view showing you the interior there. And that's actually the stage that you're seeing. And right over here is where the president's booth is located right there. My finger's jumping around because I can't direct myself very well there. All right, so anyway, that's the situation that we had with that. Okay, we'll go back here now. And I want to introduce you to an individual. And this person's name is John Wilkes Booth. Got a couple of photographs here of John Wilkes Booth. Let's see if I can do it like this. And maybe I can get a little contrast so you can see what John Wilkes Booth looked like. They said he was a nice-looking man. He was kind of a womanizer, a hard drinker, if you will. Certainly supported the Confederacy. There's no question about that. He was from a long line of actors. And yeah, I think if you look through your textbook, you'll see a photograph of his brother and his father, you know. But he was a well-known figure around Ford's Theater. He performed there regularly, so his presence in Ford's Theater would not raise an eye whatsoever. Let's see if I have another likeness here of John Wilkes Booth. And there's John Wilkes Booth right there, a rather debonair type individual here. All righty, so anyway, John Wilkes Booth had already been to the president's box earlier in the day in Ford's Theater. That was a place in which John Wilkes Booth received his mail. So he had gone by to get his mail, and he actually went up the stairs. He ascended the stairs and went down to the president's booth and entered into the president's booth. And when he did so, he had with him a little 2x4 so that he could block the door closed when he was going to return later that evening anyway. He also had the foresight to take a penknife. This was a pocket knife, and he cut a hole. He drilled a hole into it's like a peephole, so that he on the outside, and if you were in my class right now, I'd design it on the board and you'd have a pretty good idea what I'm talking about here. But he could use this as a peephole so that when the president and the president's wife and Claire Harris and Henry Rathbone were in the president's booth, then John Wilkes Booth, no pun intended, could actually look through that peephole and see where the president was. Okay, so anyway, the president and his entourage arrived at Ford's Theater. Here's another view of Ford's Theater. This is from that time frame anyway. And if you'll notice over here, let's see, am I on the right side right here? This side, this structure right here, is a saloon. And that saloon is known as the Star Saloon. If you go there today and you look through the painted over paint, and you can still see the old Star Saloon emblem there. The last time I was up there, you could anyway. Okay, so anyway, John Wilkes, excuse me, I'm sorry, I'm getting myself backwards here. All right, let me show you something else here. And here's a photograph of the president's booth. And if President Lincoln was in, let's see, President Lincoln was in this chair right here. Now, the door I was telling you about is back over here, right next to the where the president would be seated. And I don't know if this was the original chair or not for Miss Lincoln, but if that is, I think that's unkind of the president, you know, to put Mary Todd Lincoln in a straight-back chair such as that, and the president's over here in a comfortable chair. And where the two lovebirds, Claire Harris and Henry Rathbone, they were seated here on a little love seat that was behind. Now, the stage is on the other side. The stage is back over in this direction here. So the Lincolns and the entourage were late in arriving here. In fact, they got there, I think it was about midway through the play. And by the way, John Wilkes Booth had performed in Ford's Theater and had performed in Our American Cousin, so he knew all the lines verbatim. So this meant that when we were going to have a funny line and the crowd would come into a roar, he knew exactly when that was going to take place. And the president had his bodyguard with him here, and the president's bodyguard was outside of the president's booth. But for some strange reason, the president's bodyguard slipped away and went down to the saloon and helped himself to a couple of drinks there. All right, so let's go back to John Wilkes Booth. And John Wilkes Booth went back to Ford's Theater and entered into Ford's Theater, causing no problems whatsoever, and actually ascended the stairs and went up to outside of the president's booth. And he observed the activity there. There was no bodyguard, and observed the activity. And right at the appropriate time, John Wilkes Booth entered into the president's booth himself, and he was bearing a pistol. It's a .44 caliber single-shot Derringer. That's the actual pistol that was used here, and just placed this to the back of President Lincoln's the left side rear of the president's head, and he fired the bullet that would take the president's life here too. All righty, so President Lincoln had no sound. He just collapsed right there on the floor, and Major Rathbone jumped up and had a knife. Jumped up and made a grab for John Wilkes Booth, and John Wilkes Booth had a knife. It was like a Bowie knife, as a matter of fact, and he slashed Major Rathbone right across the left arm. And for Booth is now trapped. There's no going back. The theater is full of people, so he literally jumped here. He jumped out of the president's booth, and he had a pair of riding boots on, and when he jumped, the spur of the riding boot caught in the flag, and it threw him off balance and down to the floor. He tumbled here too. He landed on his left leg, went to his right knee, and jumped up and faced the audience and shouted at the audience here at 6th Temper Tyrannus, and thus to tyrants. And John Wilkes Booth went racing out the back door of the stage. And that's where he had a horse that he had left there earlier, and he jumped on the horse, and off he went. And to the countryside, eventually he went around the nation's capital, across the Navy Yard Bridge, and entered into the countryside on into Maryland. A clean escape here. Now, most of you good folks are probably familiar with that story there of John Wilkes Booth. Okay, so let me move on here. And before we completely leave this topic, and I'm not going to leave it anytime soon, well, what happens to the president? Well, the president, in turn, was taken across the street and was taken to the Peterson House. This is what the Peterson House looks like as part of the National Park Service. When you get your ticket to go into Ford's Theater, you can also, it also allows you entrance into the Peterson House itself here. And the president was taken back here to the bed of William Clark. And the president was so tall that he's 6'4", and people at that time weren't that tall. And so when they laid the president in the bed, his size was so great that they had to place him in the bed diagonally. Let's see if I have a likeness of that here, and I believe I do. And here's a likeness here showing the president in the bed there, and his cabinet members and physicians, just surrounded by friends. Mary Todd Lincoln was in there, but she was just wailing so much that finally Edwin M. Stanton, Secretary of War, just said, "Get that woman out of here." And she was driving everybody crazy with that. But nonetheless here, folks, at 7:22 the following morning, the president expired here. And now he belongs to the ages, in the words of Edwin M. Stanton. All right, so as I said a second ago, most of you probably are familiar with that, but I bet you did not know that this was actually a conspiracy. There were a number of other people that were involved in this. We had one individual here, and this person's name is Louis Payne. Here he is right here. If I can get my light right, here he is right here. Big guy, tough guy. He'd been kicked in the head by a mule. He'd been wounded at the Battle of Gettysburg. But anyway, just a tough guy and not real smart here. And he was given the responsibility to kill William H. Seward, who was the Secretary of State. And by golly, he almost did. He went to Seward's house and had a large knife with him. And he stabbed the Secretary of State many, many times. Secretary of State at that time was recovering from a carriage accident, and so a carriage accident almost killed the man. And then we had another individual, a person by the name of George Atzerodt. I'll show you the names in just a few minutes here. George Atzerodt, and that's this guy right here. Hard drinker, not really smart here. He was a carriage repair person, and he was given a responsibility to kill the president, Vice President of the United States, Andrew Johnson. And I'm going to just tell you folks here, for George Atzerodt, he just chickened out. That was just it, and went out and got dead drunk. All right, we had another individual. We'll look up here at the top here, and this person's name is Davy Harold. That's this guy right here, Davy Harold. He had graduated from Georgetown University. He's got some sense here, folks, and he was kind of the cleanup guy. If anybody else had a problem and couldn't take care of their part, then he would be the person that would take care of. And for Davy Harold, when he saw that Lewis Payne here had been apprehended, or went into hiding, I should say. He hadn't been apprehended right at that point anyway. Then Davy Harold got on a horse, and he rode across the Navy Yard Bridge and went into the countryside, and that's where he joined John Wilkes Booth. So those two individuals here are on the lam, John Wilkes Booth and Davy Harold. And when they went down, I'm looking around for some of my information here, folks. And when they rode into the countryside, they stopped at a tavern. And this is where the tavern is. It's called Surratt's Tavern. Surratt's Tavern is still open today if you wish to visit there. And this was the lady, Mary Surratt, that owned the tavern. And when John Wilkes Booth and Davy Harold stopped there, they picked up some weapons that they had stockpiled there at an earlier time. Here's another likeness here of Mary Surratt. She was the tavern owner. And I'm asking you good folks, does that make her a co-conspirator? Of course it does. Well, that's what many people thought anyway, that she is a co-conspirator. Some people today profess the innocence of Mary Surratt. Here's the Surratt Society. You can join if you wish to do so, you know. It costs you about $10, such as that, whatever. Okay, so John Wilkes Booth and Davy Harold went into the countryside and continued on from Surratt's Tavern, and that's where they stopped at a place which was known as Samuel Mudd's farm. Samuel Mudd was a physician. Here's a historical sign here. John Wilkes Booth rested here for several hours, I think it's several days, on April the 15th after receiving treatment for his broken leg. How did he get the broken leg? Well, historians will tell you today that he got the broken leg when he leaped out of the President's booth at Ford's Theater. And Samuel Mudd reported later, years later, he said, well, when John Wilkes Booth arrived, he had mud all down the left side of his, all down the side of his left leg, and that was the one that was broken. It was actually the fibula. That's the small bone in the lower leg anyway. And he also claimed, Samuel Mudd, that the horse had mud down the side. So in all probability here, it was the horse that fell and broke the leg of John Wilkes Booth, even though the park directors and park rangers in Ford's Theater will tell you otherwise with that. Okay, so while I'm catching my breath here for a second here, folks, just show you a couple of, we'll go back to this, give you a little bit better view. And a couple of books here I would have on display for you folks. You can look at these, gives you an idea of how John Wilkes Booth slipped up behind the president. And here we go. Let's do some others here. Great book here, the 150th anniversary here of the Lincoln assassination, and one of the most fascinating books if you're interested in this subject. And here's another one here, came out of Blue Green Magazine, which addresses from start to finish. In fact, that's on the front porch of Surratt's Tavern there. But these are all interesting pieces of information. So, continuing on here, folks, Davy Harold and John Wilkes Booth, going, keep saying through the countryside, but that's literally the way it was here. And I'm running out of time here, so I need to make this short here. And finally, they went down into Virginia, actually crossed the river and went into Virginia itself, and they were present at a place called the Garrett Farm. And an all-points bulletin had been put out in every direction. Any man with a mustache that even vaguely resembled John Wilkes Booth, was arrested. And there was rumors that there were two men that were up at the Garrett Farm and staying in a barn there. And an Army element, a platoon, actually rode up to the barn itself and confronted Booth. Booth was inside. Davy Harold was inside the barn. And Booth was saying, give me a chance. Just give me a sporting chance. Give me 50 yards head start. And he said, and oh, by the way, I have a man in here that had nothing to do with the assassination, and that is that of David Harold, the guy right here. And so anyway, David Harold was eased out the door. He was taken into military custody here. In the meantime, Lewis Payne here has been taken into custody. George Atzerodt was taken into custody, and Mary Surratt likewise was taken into custody too. And for some crazy reason, let me see if I can find a name for you folks here. Let's see. Let me go back here and just make sure that you had a chance to write these names down here. We had Edwin F. Stanton, the Secretary of State. Lewis Payne, that was one of these co-conspirators, his responsibility to assassinate William H. Seward, the Secretary of State. George Atzerodt, his responsibility, he killed the Vice President, Andrew Johnson, and he just lost his nerve. And the cleanup guy, Davy Harold. All right. in Surratt's Tavern, Mary Surratt. All right, Dr. Samuel Mudd. His name is Mudd, by the way, and that's where the phrase came from. And the Garrett Farm that I mentioned to you right here. It's 95 miles away from Washington, D.C. John Wilkes Booth and Davy Harold have been on the lam, so to speak, here for 14 days. And I want to make your acquaintance with a person by the name of Boston Corbett. I've got a photograph of him around here someplace, but it would take too much trouble to try to dig that out. He looked like Shemp on the Three Stooges. He parted his hair straight down the middle. And Boston Corbett, who was not an okay person here, folks, he was not of right mind. He couldn't curb his lustful thoughts, so he castrated himself with a pair of scissors. And so you can't be all right if you do that sort of thing. But this was against orders, and the barn where John Wilkes Booth was present in was set on fire. They were trying to get John Wilkes Booth just to come out peacefully. And without orders, in fact, against orders, Boston Corbett took his carbine barrel and put it through a couple of the chinks in the barn boards and shot John Wilkes Booth. And shot him in the neck and severed the spine. And there was nothing John Wilkes Booth could do except agonize for about 90 minutes before he finally expired. Today, if you go to Greenmont Cemetery in Baltimore, which I don't recommend that you go to Baltimore, it's a dangerous place, but if you go there, you can go to Greenmont Cemetery and you can find the burial plot for the Booth family. You won't find John Wilkes Booth there because he is buried in an unmarked grave, but right in this location. And all of these markers here that you're seeing right through here, those are all Booths. All right, but anyway, okay, I just happened to look over, see a couple of photographs here. So what happens to Abraham Lincoln? Abraham Lincoln will be taken to Springfield, Illinois, and you can find his home there, by the way, too. This is not his original log cabin, but he was buried in this site, buried in this place here, and then some grave robbers attempted to steal his body, of all things. You can go there if you wish to do so. Lincoln was buried a second time in a temporary grave, not very far from where the first one is, and it's just a temporary grave marker there. And then today, where President Lincoln lies in rest, is in the Lincoln tomb, which is there. Mary Todd Lincoln there, a couple of Abraham Lincoln's sons are buried there too. And here's a photograph here showing you the grave marker there for Abraham Lincoln. It's my understanding that he is buried under 50 feet of concrete, so that there'll be no further attempts to try to take the body of Abraham Lincoln. All right, so let's see here. What happens to the other individuals here that were arrested? Lengthy trial took place here, folks, and then on July of 1865 at a place which is called Fort Leslie McNair today, anyway. Let's see, I can't get this to show all the way over here. There we go. Scaffolds, gallows were constructed here, and you can see the death here after the hanging here of those individuals. Let's see here. Here is, this is Mary Surratt. Here's Lewis Payne, which is present here. Davy Harold here, and George Atzerodt, which is over there. It took 22 minutes for the big guy, for Lewis Payne, to actually die. Let's see here. And this is a place today. This is a place where the trial took place for those four individuals. It's still there at Fort Leslie McNair. And where the hanging took place, right here, that's now a tennis court, by the way. Okay, so anyway, that kind of wraps that up here. Let's see if I got anything else to mention here. So, who becomes president of the United States? I don't want to go there right now. I still have something else to talk to you about here, folks. If I can find something here. What happened to Dr. Samuel Mudd and some other conspirators? In fact, all in all, we had 8 conspirators that were involved in this. 4 of them, of course, were executed. The remainder received long terms. I think one actually escaped over to England. And for Samuel Mudd was sent out to Fort Jefferson and the Dry Tortugas. Fort Jefferson, Dry Tortugas. And let me show you a couple of other things here associated with this. And I'll tell you what, so I don't have to flip it back. Here's what Fort Jefferson looks like today, anyway. You can take the Fast Cat, and I'm talking about, a speedboat, and go out there. It's 85 miles away from Key West, by the way. And you can go out there if you wish to do so, or you can take a float plane out there. It's a fun place to visit, by the way. Do a lot of scuba diving with the piranhas. Here's a good article here that I would have out for you folks, and actually showing you Samuel Mudd, if you can see him. And there it is right there. A yellow fever epidemic ravaged Fort Jefferson, and Samuel Mudd used his physician skills to alleviate the suffering of the people that had yellow fever, and he was pardoned by the next president of the United States, Andrew Johnson here. So here we go. Andrew Johnson now becomes president of the United States. That's what he looks like. He's from Tennessee, by the way. He had been the military governor of Tennessee. It always makes you wonder how in the world did he get to be vice president, under the Republican Abraham Lincoln, but he is a Republican here. He was drunk and slurring in speech at his inauguration. People referred to him as Andy the Sot. He openly carried a pistol. Can you imagine a president carrying a pistol on himself today? I don't know. Maybe so. Maybe we can see that. So anyway, that is Andy the Sot, or Andrew Johnson. All right, let's go back here. And we're using up a lot of time here, folks. And for Andrew Johnson, he organized his plan of Reconstruction, which was called Presidential Reconstruction. It's kind of like the Wade Davis bill. If you owned $20,000 or you had a large amount of property, you had to apply to the president personally for a pardon. I will tell you right now that the radical Republicans were against everything that President Johnson was in favor for. He's from the South. By 1865, all succeeded states had formed new governments here, and they conducted elections, created their new governments. And this would include, if you will, 9 ex-Confederate congressmen, 7 ex-Confederate state officials were in these new governments, 4 Confederate generals, 4 Confederate colonels, and Alexander Hamilton Stevens was elected as a senator. So when all these former Confederate dignitaries went to Washington, D.C., the radical Republicans refused to allow them to be seated. All right, and then the radical Republicans came up with their own Reconstruction plan. And this Reconstruction plan, which is called Radical Reconstruction. And part of this was establish civil rights bills, and then President Johnson vetoed every one of those. The radical Republicans overrode the veto on each one of those. The part of it was also to establish military districts in the South, and sure enough, 5 military districts were established throughout the South here. One of the primary concerns, register qualified voters here, and that would exclude anybody that had fought for the South or supported the South. The only state that's readmitted from the South into the United States of America is Tennessee at this period of time. All right, 5 military districts in the South. Register all qualified voters. There's no good time to go through this, folks, but now is about as good as any. You need to remember, I want you to remember, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution of the United States of America. I'm going to hold you responsible for those. You could read about it in your textbook. If we had more time and we were face-to-face, we would go through that. But the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution abolishes slavery as an institution in our country forever. You cannot defy that. The 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution declares that all former slaves are citizens. All former slaves are citizens. Now, I will tell you, folks, that most southern states did not have a problem with this. Most southern states, all southern states, never had a problem with the 13th Amendment. But this is where they had a problem, with the 14th Amendment. Now we're going to take former slaves and make them citizens of the United States. All right. The 15th Amendment to the United States Constitution now gives the right to vote to all citizens. That is, unless you're a woman, and you don't get the right to vote then, And the reason for this, honest to goodness, the reason for this, if we would give women, if the radical Republicans would give women the right to vote, then the women would vote their husband's wishes that had been disenfranchised in the South. That's exactly what it was. What the radical Republicans wanted, they wanted to give former slaves the right to vote in the South, but not in the North. The radical Republicans wanted to give not only equal rights to former slaves, they wanted to give extra rights to former slaves. All right, but eventually we're going to find in 1868, Arkansas, North Carolina, South Carolina, Louisiana, Alabama, Georgia, and Florida will be readmitted to the United States of America. In the following year, 1869, Virginia and Texas readmitted into the Union, and always last in everything, in 1870, Mississippi is readmitted into the United States of America. All right. And as I told you a few minutes ago, women's suffrage, there was this great fear that women would vote the wishes of their husband. In the South, 25% of Southern white males were disenfranchised. And what this creates here, folks, this will create in the state of South Carolina, and you see that in the state of South Carolina, Mississippi, Louisiana, Alabama, and Florida, what we're going to get there is black voting majorities here. Black voting majority. So unusual there. Blacks have the right to vote. Former slaves have the right to vote, if you're a male anyway. And we have 25% of the whites that lost their right to vote. And we see such very odd things here for that period of time. Senator Hiram Revels from Mississippi, a black man, is chosen as elected as a senator. Blanche Bruce, Mississippi, black man, is elected as a senator. PBS Pinchback, lieutenant governor, elected lieutenant governor from Louisiana, a black man. All right, let me show you some photographs here. I told you this a little bit earlier. Freedman School, which is present here. Okay, here's Charles Sumner, radical Republican. Thaddeus Stevens, radical Republican. Senator Hiram Revels, a African-American senator from Mississippi. Okay, so anyway, that's that. Okay, let's move on and see what else we have here. Now, a couple of negative terms here, folks. We have a term which is called scalawags. Scalawags, Southern white Republicans. It's not appropriate today because many Southern whites are Republicans today, and in fact more so than Democrats. Carpetbaggers, another negative term here. These were Northern Republicans that would go south, and by going south, they could buy Southern property, businesses there. You could seek political office when white Southerners could not. All right, I want you to recognize both those terms, scalawags and carpetbaggers. All right, looks like we're about 41 minutes into the lecture here, folks, so I think it's probably a pretty good place to stop here. Still got to talk to you about Reconstruction. We'll wrap that up, hopefully a little bit earlier than usual, maybe in about 30 minutes or 25 minutes, but no promises on that, okay? So we have one final lecture remaining, and then I have to review you for your third examination here, folks. All right, thank you for your attention. This is a very interesting piece of history.